Subscribe to Storylab for more stories. Now, let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Quiet Life. Curtis Rose wiped the sweat from his brow as he guided the tractor back toward the barn, the setting sun painting the Iowa countryside in shades of amber and gold. 3 years ago, he'd bought this 100-acre farm with cash, telling his wife Whitney it was his dream to live simply after a career in private security. She'd laughed and called him her gentle giant, never suspecting that her husband's calloused hands had once assembled enough C4 to level city blocks. Curtis had spent 12 years in Special Forces, the last 4 as a demolitions specialist for operations that didn't officially exist. Black sites, regime changes, surgical strikes that left no witnesses. He'd done them all with the cold precision of a craftsman. But after watching too many good men die for politicians' lies, he'd walked away. The only thing he'd kept from that life was his paranoia and a very specific reason for choosing this particular piece of land. Whitney Garrett Rose stepped onto the porch as he approached, her auburn hair catching the last rays of sunlight. At 32, she still looked like the small-town beauty queen who'd caught his eye at a gas station 2 counties over. They'd married 6 months later in a simple ceremony that her father, Sheriff Rex Garrett, had attended with barely concealed disapproval. "Dinner's ready," she called, her smile warm and genuine. Curtis felt the familiar pang of guilt as he looked at her. Whitney thought she'd married a reformed drifter seeking redemption through honest work. She had no idea she'd actually married a ghost, a man so deeply buried in classified operations that even his military records were scrubbed clean. As they ate Whitney's pot roast, she chattered about her day at the county courthouse where she worked as a clerk. Curtis listened with half his attention, the other half noting the small details that kept him alive during his operational years. The way she avoided eye contact when mentioning her lunch with her father. The slight tremor in her voice when she asked about his plans for the weekend. The fact that she'd mentioned needing to visit her father tomorrow night, something she'd never done without asking him to come along. "You seem distracted," Whitney said, reaching across to touch his hand. "Everything okay?" Curtis covered her hand with his, studying her face. "Just thinking about the north field. Soil's been acting strange where I want to plant the winter wheat." It wasn't entirely a lie. The soil in the north field was different because it sat directly above what used to be Storage Facility Delta 7, a decommissioned Special Forces armory that officially never existed. Curtis had spent 2 years researching the property before buying it, using contacts from his old life to verify that the underground facility was still intact, still stocked, and still forgotten by everyone except a handful of ghosts like himself. After dinner, Curtis excused himself to check on the livestock. In reality, he made his way to the barn's false wall, entering the hidden room where he maintained a modest cache of surveillance equipment. Nothing fancy, just enough to keep tabs on his property and the approaches to it. Old habits died hard, and in his experience, paranoia was just pattern recognition for people who'd survived long enough to develop it. The motion sensors he'd placed along the county road showed nothing unusual, but something felt off. Whitney's behavior, the timing of her father's sudden dinner invitation, the way she'd been asking more questions about his past lately. Individually, these things meant nothing. Together, they painted a picture that made Curtis's combat instincts scream warnings. He'd met Sheriff Rex Garrett exactly 5 times, and each encounter had left Curtis with the impression of a man who wore his badge like a crown. Garrett was old-school corrupt, the kind who saw his county as a personal kingdom and viewed Curtis as an unwelcome outsider who'd stolen his daughter. But corruption was one thing. The look in Garrett's eyes during their last meeting suggested something far more dangerous. Curtis had seen that look before, in the eyes of warlords and cartel bosses who'd discovered someone knew too much about their operations. It was the look of a man weighing whether someone needed to disappear. As he locked up the barn and headed back to the house, Curtis found Whitney on the phone in the kitchen, speaking in low tones. She ended the call quickly when she saw him, offering another one of those bright smiles that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Just Dad," she said, busying herself with washing dishes that were already clean. "You know how he gets." Curtis nodded and headed upstairs, but his mind was already shifting into operational mode. Tomorrow, while Whitney visited her father, he'd conduct a full sweep of the property and review his contingency plans. If Rex Garrett was planning something, Curtis Rose, the man who'd once rigged an entire mountain base to collapse with a flip of a single switch, would be ready. The quiet life had been nice while it lasted. Chapter 2: Blood and Badge. Sheriff Rex Garrett poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon and stared out his office window at the neon lights of Millfield's Main Street. At 58, he'd held the sheriff's badge for nearly 20 years, long enough to understand that law and order were flexible concepts, especially when you controlled both the definitions and the enforcement. His empire was modest but profitable. The trucking companies paid him to ensure their overweight rigs never got weighed. The motorcycle club that ran meth through 3 counties made sure his campaign fund stayed healthy. The illegal gambling operation in the back of Sweeney's bar contributed to his daughter's college fund. Not that Whitney ever needed to know where that money came from. Rex had built his kingdom carefully, surrounding himself with deputies who either shared his flexible morality or were too stupid to realize what was happening around them. Deputy Tom Baldwin fell into the former category, a violent man who enjoyed the power that came with a badge and a gun. Deputy Dave Field was firmly in the latter, a good-natured farm boy who still believed they were the good guys. The problem was Curtis Rose. Rex took another sip of bourbon and reviewed what he knew about his son-in-law. The man had appeared out of nowhere 3 years ago with enough cash to buy prime farmland and no verifiable history beyond a few scattered references to private security work. His background check had come back suspiciously clean, the kind of clean that suggested professional scrubbing rather than an honest life. But it was the way Curtis carried himself that really bothered Rex. The man moved like a predator, all controlled grace and constant awareness. Rex had seen enough soldiers pass through his county to recognize the type. Special operations, the kind of men who killed people for the government and never talked about it afterward. The phone on his desk buzzed. "Sheriff? It's Daryl Sweeney. We need to talk." Rex grimaced. Daryl Sweeney owned half the legitimate businesses in town and all of the illegitimate ones. He was also Rex's most important partner, which made his worried tone particularly troubling. "What's the problem, Daryl?" "It's about your son-in-law. Some of my boys were moving product through his area last night, and they swear they saw him watching from the tree line, with night vision equipment." Rex's blood chilled. The route Sweeney's people used passed within a quarter-mile of Curtis's property, close enough for surveillance, but far enough away that an honest farmer would never notice. If Curtis was actively watching the drug runs, it meant he knew exactly what was happening in Rex's county. "You sure about this?" "Sure enough that I'm moving the operation to the old mining road until we deal with him." "Rex, if this guy's some kind of federal agent." "He's not federal," Rex said quickly. "I've got contacts at every agency. Curtis Rose doesn't exist in their systems." "Then what is he?" Rex stared at the family photo on his desk, taken at Whitney's wedding. Curtis stood behind his daughter with his hands on her shoulders, smiling at the camera, but his eyes were scanning the crowd. Even at his own wedding, the man had been watching for threats. "Something worse than federal," Rex admitted. "The kind of ghost the government uses when they need things done without paperwork." There was a long pause before Sweeney spoke again. "So what do we do?" Rex finished his bourbon and made the decision that would define the rest of his life. "We eliminate the problem. Tonight." After ending the call, Rex walked to his gun safe and withdrew his personal arsenal, a tactical shotgun, his service pistol, and the AR-15 he'd confiscated from a drug dealer and never bothered to report. If Curtis Rose was some kind of retired special operator, Rex would need overwhelming firepower and the element of surprise. He called Deputy Baldwin first. "Tom, I need you to round up Jake and Sam. Emergency operation tonight." "What kind of operation, Sheriff?" "The kind that doesn't get discussed over open channels. Meet me at the station in 1 hour, full tactical gear." His next call was to Whitney. His daughter answered on the second ring, her voice bright and unsuspecting. "Hi, Dad. I was just about to call you." "Whitney, honey, I need you to do something for me. It's about Curtis." The line went quiet for a moment. "What about Curtis?" "I've been investigating some suspicious activity in your area." drug runners, possibly armed and dangerous. I need you to make sure Curtis isn't planning to be anywhere near your barn tonight. Dad, that's ridiculous. Curtis would never. Whitney, Rex's voice hardened. I've been doing this job longer than you've been alive. Trust me when I tell you that your husband isn't the man you think he is. Keep him in the house tonight, or better yet, get him away from the property entirely. He could hear Whitney's breathing change, the first cracks appearing in her perfect little world. What are you saying? I'm saying that sometimes the people we love aren't who they pretend to be. Can you do this for me? Can you keep Curtis away from the barn tonight? Another long pause. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, yes, Daddy. I can do that. As Rex hung up the phone, he felt a brief pang of guilt for involving Whitney in what was about to happen. But his daughter would understand eventually. Curtis Rose represented an existential threat to everything Rex had built, and in his world, threats got eliminated. He just hoped Curtis would make it easy and go down fighting. Dead heroes were so much easier to explain than prisoners who might talk. Chapter 3. The Betrayal. Curtis woke at 4 a.m. out of pure habit, his internal clock still calibrated to mission schedules from a life he'd supposedly left behind. Whitney lay beside him, her breathing shallow and irregular, the pattern of someone pretending to sleep. He'd noticed her tossing and turning most of the night, and the slight tension in her body told him she was awake now, waiting for him to leave for his morning routine. He dressed quietly and headed downstairs, noting that Whitney's purse was sitting by the front door with her car keys prominently displayed, unusual for someone who typically left them scattered around the house. Through the kitchen window, he could see the barn silhouetted against the pre-dawn darkness, and every instinct he'd developed over 12 years of covert operations was screaming at him to run. Instead, Curtis made coffee and settled into his morning routine, all while listening to Whitney move around upstairs. She was making phone calls, her voice too low to make out words, but the cadence was wrong, urgent, stressed, guilty. When she finally came downstairs an hour later, she was fully dressed and clearly agitated. "I need to go see Dad today," she announced without preamble. "He called last night after he went to bed. There's some kind of family emergency." Curtis studied his wife's face, noting the micro-expressions that betrayed deception. The slight downturn at the corners of her mouth, the way her eyes focused just past his shoulder rather than meeting his gaze directly, the unconscious touching of her throat that indicated stress. "What kind of emergency?" he asked gently. "Uncle Leonard. He's in the hospital." Whitney's voice caught slightly on the lie, and Curtis felt something cold settle in his chest. She'd mentioned Uncle Leonard before, Rex's brother who lived in Florida and hadn't spoken to the family in 15 years. "I'm sorry to hear that. Do you want me to come with you?" "No." The response was too quick, too sharp. Whitney immediately tried to recover. "I mean, you have that field work you want to get done, and it's just going to be a lot of family drama. You know how my dad gets." Curtis nodded and reached across to squeeze her hand. "Of course. Take all the time you need." But as Whitney gathered her things and headed for the door, Curtis was already moving to his hidden surveillance room. The motion sensors he'd placed along all approach routes to the property were showing normal patterns. Morning commuters, school buses, farm equipment. Nothing suggested imminent threat, but his instincts were screaming otherwise. He activated the long-range listening device aimed at the county road and immediately picked up radio chatter on the sheriff's department frequency. What he heard made his blood turn to ice. "Perimeter established at 0800 hours. Target is to be considered armed and extremely dangerous. Rules of engagement are weapons free on my command." Curtis closed his eyes and felt the last 3 years of peaceful domesticity crumble around him. Whitney hadn't just lied to him. She'd actively participated in setting him up for assassination. The woman he'd married, the woman he'd trusted with his heart, if not his secrets, was working with her father to have him killed. He switched to the audio feed from the listening device he'd discreetly placed in Whitney's car 6 months ago during a routine maintenance check, standard operational security that he'd told himself was just paranoia. Now he wished he'd been wrong. Whitney's voice came through clearly. "Daddy, he's leaving for the North Field in about an hour. He always checks the livestock first, then works his way toward the barn. Rex Garrett's voice. Good girl. You did the right thing, Whitney. Curtis is dangerous. More dangerous than you know. When this is over, I'll explain everything. You promise he won't suffer? You promise it'll be quick? I promise, honey. This is the only way. Curtis turned off the recording and sat in the darkness of his hidden room, processing the magnitude of the betrayal. Whitney wasn't just an unwitting accomplice. She was an active participant in his planned murder. The woman who'd shared his bed for 3 years, who'd talked about having children someday, who'd claimed to love him more than life itself, had just coordinated the timing of his execution with her corrupt father. But as the initial shock faded, Curtis found himself shifting into the cold, analytical mindset that had kept him alive through a dozen black operations in hostile territory. Whitney and Rex had made several critical errors in their planning. First, they assumed Curtis was just another mark, a civilian with no special training or resources. Second, they'd chosen to attack his property, the one place on Earth where Curtis held every possible advantage. Third, and most importantly, they had no idea what lay beneath the Northfield. Curtis moved to his secure communications array and began making calls to numbers that didn't officially exist. Old contacts, former teammates, people who owed him favors from operations that never happened. Within an hour, he confirmed what his instincts had already told him. Rex Garrett was planning a raid on his property with at least 4 armed deputies, scheduled for midnight when they could claim self-defense against an armed property owner. The irony wasn't lost on him. Rex Garrett, in his arrogance and corruption, was about to lead his men onto a killing field that Curtis had spent 2 years preparing for a threat that might never come. Storage facility Delta 7 contained enough military-grade hardware to outfit a small army, and Curtis knew every inch of it. He spent the rest of the day preparing, moving through the underground facility like a ghost returning to haunt an old battlefield. Motion sensors, automated defensive systems, night vision equipment, and enough firepower to stop a battalion. All perfectly maintained and completely forgotten by the bureaucrats who'd ordered it built. As the sun set over his farm, Curtis Rose positioned himself in the hardened observation post that overlooked the entire North Field. His phone buzzed with a text message from Whitney. Staying with Dad tonight. Love you. Curtis deleted the message without responding. The woman who'd sent it was already dead to him. Tonight, he'd find out if Rex Garrett was stupid enough to join her. The quiet life was over. Now it was time to remind these small-town predators what a real monster looked like. Chapter 4. The Reckoning Begins. Curtis spent the afternoon moving through storage facility Delta 7 like a ghost revisiting his past. The underground complex stretched beneath his entire North Field, 3 levels of hardened concrete and steel that had once served as a forward supply depot for operations that officially never existed. The government had abandoned it after the Cold War, sealing the entrances and forgetting it existed, exactly the kind of bureaucratic oversight that Curtis had learned to exploit during his operational years. Level 1 contained small arms and ammunition, enough rifles, pistols, and explosives to outfit a small military unit. Level 2 housed the communications equipment and surveillance gear that Curtis had been gradually integrating into his farm security system. But it was Level 3 that would turn Rex Garrett's planned raid into a nightmare. Automated defensive systems that could turn the entire Northfield into a kill zone at the flip of a switch. Curtis methodically activated each system, testing targeting computers that hadn't been used in 15 years but still functioned with military precision. The thermal imaging array came online first, followed by the motion detection grid that could track individual targets across the entire field. Finally, he activated the defensive turrets, concealed weapons platforms that would rise from hidden positions throughout the area. He wasn't planning mass murder. Curtis Rose was many things, but he wasn't a psychopath. Instead, he was preparing to give Rex Garrett and his men a choice: surrender or die. The fact that he suspected they'd choose poorly wasn't his problem. As night fell, Curtis positioned himself in the main control room, surrounded by monitors that gave him a god's-eye view of his property. At 9 p.m., his perimeter sensors detected movement along the eastern approach, 4 vehicles moving without lights, taking positions around his land. Rex was being smart, surrounding the property before moving in. Curtis activated his comm system and tuned into the sheriff's department frequency. What he heard confirmed his worst suspicions about the level of corruption in Rex Garrett's organization. Team Alpha, this is Control. Target is confirmed inside the residence. Execute Phase 1. Deputy Tom Baldwin's voice crackled back. Control, we have movement in the barn area. Thermal shows one figure, possibly armed. Negative Alpha. Target should be in the house. Verify your contact. Curtis smiled grimly as he realized what was happening. Rex had positioned snipers around the property, but they were seeing the thermal decoys he'd activated, military-grade heat sources that mimicked human signatures. The old paranoia was paying dividends already. At 10:30 p.m., Whitney's car pulled into the driveway. Curtis watched through his cameras as his wife got out and walked to the front door, fumbling with her keys like someone who was nervous about what came next. She disappeared inside, and Curtis's interior cameras showed her moving through the house, calling his name as if searching for him. His secure phone buzzed with a call from an unlisted number. Curtis answered on the first ring. Curtis. Whitney's voice was shaky, frightened. Where are you? I came home, and you're not here. I'm exactly where I need to be, Curtis replied calmly. The question is, why are you there? I thought you were staying with your father tonight. There was a long pause before Whitney spoke again. I needed to check on something. Curtis, we need to talk. There are things about Dad that you don't understand. I understand more than you think. Tell me, Whitney, when did you decide I needed to die? The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of 3 years of lies finally collapsing. When Whitney finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. How long have you known? Known that your father is corrupt? Months. Known that you've been helping him? Hours. The question now is whether you're brave enough to walk away from this, or if you're going to let Rex Garrett turn you into an accessory to murder. Through his cameras, Curtis watched Whitney sink into their kitchen chair, her face buried in her hands. You don't understand. Dad said you were dangerous, that you weren't who you claimed to be. He showed me things. What things? Pictures. Financial records. He said you were some kind of criminal, that you've been lying to me about everything. Curtis felt a cold rage settle in his chest. Rex Garrett hadn't just corrupted his daughter. He'd systematically poisoned her against her own husband with fabricated evidence. And you believed him without ever asking me directly? I wanted to, but I was scared. Dad said if I confronted you, you might run or hurt me. Whitney, listen to me very carefully. In about 90 minutes, your father is planning to raid this property with armed deputies. He's going to claim I shot first, that it was self-defense. He's planned your widowhood down to the minute. That's not. He wouldn't. He's using you as bait, Whitney. You're supposed to be here when they arrive to make it look more believable when they claim I went crazy and started shooting. You're not his accomplice. You're his final victim. Through the cameras, Curtis watched Whitney's face transform as the full scope of her father's manipulation became clear. The woman he'd married, naive, trusting, incapable of seeing evil in the people she loved, was finally waking up to the monster her father had become. What do I do? She whispered. Curtis considered his options. In 15 minutes, Rex Garrett's men would begin their final approach. Curtis could end this cleanly, activate the defensive systems, eliminate the threat, and disappear back into the shadows where ghosts like him belonged. Whitney would be free, and the corruption in this county would die with her father. But looking at his wife through the camera, seeing the devastation in her eyes as her world collapsed around her, Curtis made a different choice. Get in your car and drive south. Don't stop until you reach the state line, and don't look back. What happens next isn't something you should see. Curtis, I'm so sorry. I never meant for. I know. Now go. Curtis watched Whitney leave, her taillights disappearing down the county road toward a future that no longer included him. Then he turned his attention to the monitors showing Rex Garrett's men moving into position around his property. The reckoning was about to begin. Chapter 5. Ghosts and Monsters. Sheriff Rex Garrett checked his watch and keyed his radio. All units, this is Control. Phase 2 initiates in 10 minutes. Remember, our target is a trained killer who won't hesitate to put rounds downrange. Stay sharp, stay alive, and let's finish this thing. Rex was positioned in his command vehicle a quarter-mile from Curtis's property, close enough to coordinate the operation, but far enough away to claim plausible deniability if things went sideways. Through his night vision scope, he could see the farmhouse dark and silent, exactly as it should be with Curtis supposedly asleep and unaware of what was coming. Deputy Tom Baldwin's voice crackled over the radio. "Control, Sniper 1. I've got good overwatch on the barn area. No movement detected. Sniper 2, reporting clear sight lines to the main house," added Deputy Jake Hammond from his position on the opposite side of the property. Rex smiled. Everything was proceeding according to plan. In 20 minutes, Curtis Rose would be dead, and Rex's empire would be secure for another generation. The only loose end would be explaining to Whitney why her husband had opened fire on law enforcement officers, but Rex had already prepared that story. Curtis was unstable, paranoid, probably suffering from PTSD from his mysterious military service. It was tragic, but unavoidable. "Team Alpha, begin your approach," Rex commanded. Deputies Baldwin and Dave Field emerged from the tree line, moving in a tactical formation toward the barn. Rex had briefed them that Curtis was known to work late in the barn, maintaining equipment and checking on livestock. The plan was simple: catch him outside the house where there would be no question about trespassing, provoke a confrontation, and end it with overwhelming firepower. But as Baldwin and Field reached the barn perimeter, something felt wrong. The building was too quiet, too dark. Even the livestock seemed unnaturally still. "Control, this is Alpha 1. Baldwin whispered into his radio. "Barn appears empty. No thermal signatures, no movement." Rex frowned. "Sweep the building. Target may be concealed inside." What happened next would haunt Dave Field for the rest of his life. As he and Baldwin entered the barn through the main door, motion-activated lights blazed to life, temporarily blinding them. When their vision cleared, they found themselves staring at a figure in full military tactical gear. Night vision goggles pushed up on his forehead, assault rifle held in a professional grip that spoke of years of training. "Gentlemen," Curtis Rose said calmly, "I think we need to have a conversation." Baldwin, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm, froze as Curtis's rifle swung toward him with mechanical precision. "I wouldn't," Curtis advised. "Deputy Field, I want you to key your radio and tell Sheriff Garrett that his plan has encountered a complication." Field, his training as a small-town deputy utterly inadequate for this situation, stammered into his radio, "Control, this is Alpha 2. We've got a situation here." Rex's voice came back immediately. "Define situation, Alpha 2. Curtis stepped forward and took Field's radio. "Hello, Rex. This is Curtis Rose. I believe you, and I need to discuss the terms of your surrender." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Rex Garrett's heavy breathing over the radio. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with barely controlled rage. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, boy. Actually, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. Rex Garrett, sheriff for 19 years, taking bribes from Daryl Sweeney's operation, skimming money from drug seizures, and using his badge to eliminate anyone who threatens his little kingdom. The question is whether you know who you're dealing with." Curtis gestured for Baldwin and Field to remove their weapons and place them on the ground. Both men complied, their training finally kicking in enough to recognize a superior force when they encountered one. "See, Rex, you made several mistakes tonight. First, you assumed I was just another civilian you could intimidate or eliminate. Second, you brought knives to a gunfight, metaphorically speaking. But your biggest mistake was involving Whitney in this. My daughter chose her family over a lying piece of shit," Rex snarled over the radio. "Your daughter was manipulated by a corrupt father who was willing to make her an accessory to murder. But that ends tonight." Curtis looked at the two deputies standing before him, noting that Field appeared genuinely confused while Baldwin was calculating angles of attack, like the career thug he was. "Deputy Field," Curtis said, "I want you to listen very carefully. Your sheriff has been running a criminal enterprise for years, and tonight he planned to add murder to his resume. You have a choice: walk away from this clean, or go down with him as an accomplice." Field, his world view crumbling, managed to stammer, "I don't understand." Sheriff Garrett said, "You were the criminal." Ask yourself this, deputy. Why did the sheriff plan this raid for midnight instead of executing a proper warrant during daylight hours? Why are you here in tactical gear instead of with backup and procedural oversight? Why hasn't anyone called in the state police or federal authorities if I'm really the dangerous criminal Garrett claims? The questions hung in the air like grenades with pulled pins. Field was beginning to understand the scope of his sheriff's corruption, but Baldwin was still looking for an opening. Deputy Baldwin, Curtis continued, "I can see you calculating whether you can reach that backup piece you've got tucked behind your vest. I'd strongly advise against it. You see, this barn isn't just a barn." Curtis pressed a button on a small remote, and the walls of the barn suddenly came alive with red laser dots, dozens of them, all trained on Baldwin and Field. Both men froze as they realized they were standing in the crosshairs of automated defensive systems. "Welcome to Storage Facility Delta 7, Curtis said quietly. "What you're seeing is just the tip of the iceberg. I've spent 2 years turning this entire property into the kind of killing field that your sheriff's little army isn't prepared to handle." Over the radio, Rex Garrett's voice had lost all pretense of authority. "What the hell are you?" Curtis keyed the radio and answered with the cold professionalism of a man who'd spent years in the shadows. "I'm the monster you created when you decided to threaten my family. The question now, Rex, is how many of your men you're willing to sacrifice to protect your dirty little empire." The game had changed, and Sheriff Rex Garrett was about to learn that some ghosts were better left undisturbed. Chapter 6, The Trap Springs. Rex Garrett stared at his radio in disbelief, his mind struggling to process the tactical situation that had just been handed to him. Curtis Rose wasn't just some drifter with military training. He was something far more dangerous, a professional who'd been 3 steps ahead of them from the beginning. "All units, fall back to perimeter positions," Rex commanded, his voice betraying none of the panic he felt. "We're dealing with a fortified position." But as his remaining deputies, Jake Hammond and Sam Welch, began to reposition, Curtis's voice crackled over their frequency again. "I'm afraid I can't allow that, Rex. You see, you men are already inside my perimeter. Deputy Hammond, if you look down at your feet, you'll notice you're standing on a pressure plate. Deputy Welch, that red dot dancing on your chest isn't a laser pointer." Rex grabbed his binoculars and swept the tree line where his snipers were positioned. Through the night vision scope, he could see both men frozen in place, their body language screaming fear and confusion. "This is impossible," Rex muttered, then keyed his radio again. "Curtis, let's discuss terms. You're outnumbered and surrounded. Surrender now, and I guarantee safe passage to county lockup." Curtis's laughter came back cold and mocking. "Rex, you still don't understand. I'm not surrounded, you are. Storage Facility Delta 7 covers 3 square miles of this property, and every inch of it is under my control. Your men aren't in attack positions. They're standing in a kill box." To prove his point, Curtis activated the facility's external lighting system. Suddenly, the entire north field was illuminated by military-grade floodlights, revealing not just the positions of Rex's deputies, but also the dozens of concealed defensive emplacements that had been hidden in the darkness. Rex felt his mouth go dry as he realized the scope of what he was facing. This wasn't a farmhouse assault on an isolated target. This was a military installation masquerading as civilian property, and he just led his men into the kind of trap that ate entire platoons for breakfast. "Jesus Christ," Deputy Hammond's voice came over the radio, shaky with fear. "Sheriff, there are gun turrets everywhere. This whole field is wired for war." Curtis's voice cut through the chatter with military precision. "Sheriff Garrett, I'm going to give you and your men exactly 5 minutes to make a choice. You can surrender, and I'll ensure that Deputies Field and Welch, the 2 clean cops you brought tonight, make it home to their families. Or you can escalate this situation, and I'll demonstrate exactly what 12 years of black operations training looks like when applied to home defense." Rex's mind raced through his options. He could call for backup from the state police, but that would require explaining why he'd launched an unauthorized raid on a civilian property. He could try to fight his way out, but Curtis clearly held every tactical advantage. Or he could cut his losses and run, but that would mean abandoning his men and his empire. The decision was made for him when Deputy Baldwin's voice crackled over the radio. "Sheriff, this whole thing is fucked. Rose has enough firepower down here to stop an army. We need to pull back and regroup." "Negative," Rex snapped. "We finish this tonight." But even as he gave the order, Rex knew he was making the wrong choice. His pride, his corruption, and his hatred of Curtis Rose were overriding his tactical judgment. He was about to escalate a situation that was already beyond his control. "Curtis," Rex keyed his radio. "You want to play soldier? Let's play. I've got enough firepower out here to level your little fort." "Rex," Curtis replied, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who'd seen too many politicians make the same mistake. "You just chose poorly." The first indication that Rex had miscalculated came when his command vehicle's radio array suddenly went dead. Then the engine shut off, followed by the complete failure of all electrical systems. Similar reports came in from his other vehicles. Every piece of electronic equipment in his mobile command post had been neutralized by some kind of electromagnetic pulse. "What the hell?" Rex began, but his question was answered when Curtis's voice came through a loudspeaker system that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere. "Electronic warfare, Rex. I've just disabled every piece of modern equipment you brought to this party. Your radios, your vehicles, your night vision gear. All of it is now expensive paperweights. But don't worry, I've left your weapons functional. This is going to be decided by marksmanship and tactics, not technology." Rex grabbed his backup radio, but it was as dead as everything else. He was effectively cut off from his men, stranded in a disabled vehicle, facing an enemy who could apparently control the electromagnetic spectrum at will. Through his mechanical backup binoculars, Rex watched as his carefully planned operation disintegrated into chaos. His deputies were pinned down by defensive systems they couldn't see, couldn't counter, and couldn't escape. Worse, they were beginning to realize that their sheriff had led them into a trap that might cost them their lives. Deputy Field's voice echoed across the field through a megaphone. "Sheriff Garrett, Curtis Rose is offering safe passage for anyone who surrenders immediately. He says this is your last chance." Rex felt his empire crumbling around him. Years of careful corruption, decades of building his personal kingdom, all of it threatened by one man who'd had the audacity to marry his daughter and live peacefully on a farm that turned out to be a fortress. But Rex Garrett hadn't survived 19 years as a corrupt sheriff by backing down from fights. If Curtis Rose wanted a war, Rex would give him one, even if it meant burning down everything he'd built in the process. He grabbed his shotgun and began moving toward the tree line. If his men wouldn't fight, he'd finish this himself. The trap had been sprung, but the killing hadn't started yet. Chapter 7: The Killing Field. Curtis watched through his surveillance cameras as Rex Garrett abandoned his disabled command vehicle and began moving toward the tree line with a shotgun. The man's tactical incompetence was almost painful to observe. He was silhouetting himself against the emergency lighting, moving without cover and telegraphing his position to anyone with basic military training. "Sheriff," Curtis's voice boomed across the field through the facility's public address system. "You're about to enter a designated killing field." Last warning. Rex's response was to fire his shotgun into the air in defiance, a gesture that would have been laughable if it wasn't about to get people killed. Curtis sighed and activated the facility's final defensive protocol. The ground began to rumble as concealed platforms rose from hidden positions throughout the north field. Automated turrets emerged from camouflaged bunkers, their barrels tracking individual targets with mechanical precision. Motion sensors painted laser designators on anything larger than a rabbit, and proximity alarms began wailing like banshees. Curtis had spent 2 years preparing for the possibility that his past might catch up with him. He'd never imagined that the threat would come from his wife's corrupt father, but the preparation was the same regardless of the enemy. "Deputies Hammond and Welch," Curtis announced, "you have 10 seconds to drop your weapons and move to the white circle painted on the ground 50 meters to your east. That's a safe zone. Anyone still armed and outside that zone in 15 seconds becomes a legitimate target. Deputy Sam Welch, the younger of Rex's two snipers, immediately complied. He could see the red dots of a dozen targeting systems painted on his chest, and his survival instincts overrode his loyalty to a sheriff who'd led him into a nightmare. He dropped his rifle and ran for the safe zone like his life depended on it. Deputy Jake Hammond hesitated, torn between his fear of Curtis and his fear of disappointing Rex Garrett. The hesitation cost him. Curtis had programmed the automated systems with rules of engagement based on his military experience. Non-lethal force first, escalating to lethal only when absolutely necessary. Hammond found himself on the receiving end of a rubber bullet fired from a concealed turret, the impact spinning him around and dropping him to the ground with cracked ribs, but no permanent damage. Deputy Hammond is wounded but alive, Curtis announced. Medical assistance will be provided after all weapons are secured. In the barn, Deputies Baldwin and Field were having their own crisis of conscience. Baldwin had realized that his backup weapon was useless against automated defensive systems, while Field was beginning to understand that everything Curtis had told him about Sheriff Garrett was true. "Tom," Field whispered, "we need to surrender. This guy's got military-grade hardware, and he's offering us a way out." Baldwin's response was to grab for his concealed pistol anyway, a move that triggered 3 different motion sensors simultaneously. The result was immediate and overwhelming. Rubber bullets from multiple angles, flashbang grenades that left him temporarily deaf and blind, and restraint cables that wrapped around his arms and legs like mechanical snakes. "Deputy Baldwin has been neutralized," Curtis announced. "He'll require medical attention, but will survive." "Deputy Field, you're free to leave through the main barn door. Your cooperation is noted and appreciated." Field stumbled out of the barn, his ears ringing and his worldview shattered, but alive and unharmed. He could see other emergency responders approaching from the county road. Real cops, not Rex's corrupt inner circle, drawn by reports of gunfire and explosions. Rex Garrett, meanwhile, had reached the edge of the tree line and was getting his first close look at storage facility Delta 7's defensive capabilities. The turrets tracking his movement weren't civilian security cameras. They were military-grade weapons platforms with armor plating and electronic countermeasures. The bunkers weren't fake. They were reinforced concrete emplacements that could withstand rocket attacks. "Curtis!" Rex screamed into the night, his voice cracking with rage and fear. "This ends between you and me. Man to man." Curtis's response came through speakers positioned throughout the trees. "Rex, you stopped being a man the moment you decided to murder your daughter's husband. You're a corrupt coward who hides behind a badge and sends other people to do his killing." But even as Curtis delivered his judgment, he was making preparations for what came next. Rex Garrett was clearly not going to surrender, which meant Curtis would have to make a choice that would define the rest of his life. Kill a man in cold blood, or find another way to end this that wouldn't make him the monster Rex claimed he was. The decision was made for him when Rex fired his shotgun directly at one of the surveillance cameras, destroying it in a shower of sparks and plastic. The shot was close enough to Curtis's actual position that it qualified as attempted murder under any reasonable rules of engagement. Curtis triggered the final protocol. The automated systems had been programmed with one absolute priority: protect the facility at all costs. Rex Garrett had just declared himself a hostile force actively attacking the installation, which made him a legitimate target for lethal force. The targeting computer painted Rex with every available weapon system simultaneously, creating a light show of red dots that turned the corrupt sheriff into a human Christmas tree. But instead of firing immediately, Curtis activated the loudspeaker one final time. "Rex Garrett, you are surrounded by automated defensive systems programmed to protect this facility. You have 5 seconds to drop your weapon and surrender, or you will be eliminated as a hostile threat. This is your final warning." Rex's response was exactly what Curtis expected from a man whose pride had always been stronger than his survival instinct. He raised his shotgun and aimed it directly at the nearest turret. "Fuck you and your warnings," Rex snarled. The killing field earned its name in the space of 3 seconds. 16 different weapon systems fired simultaneously, turning Sheriff Rex Garrett into a cautionary tale about the consequences of threatening people who possess the skills and resources to defend themselves. When the smoke cleared, Curtis Rose stood alone in his fortress, surrounded by the wreckage of a corrupt sheriff's final play for power. The quiet life was truly over now, but the monster that Rex Garrett had unleashed was finally satisfied. Justice, Curtis reflected, sometimes wore night vision goggles and spoke through automated weapon systems. It wasn't pretty, but it was effective. Chapter 8, Aftermath. The state police arrived 90 minutes after the gunfire stopped, followed by federal agents who seemed to know exactly what they were looking for despite having no official reason to be there. Curtis Rose met them at his property line, no longer the simple farmer who'd bought acreage to live quietly, but not yet willing to reveal the full extent of what lay beneath his north field. Special Agent Genevieve Hayden of the FBI showed her credentials and studied Curtis with the kind of professional assessment that suggested she already knew more about him than his wife had learned in 3 years of marriage. "Mr. Rose," she said carefully, "we need to discuss what happened here tonight." Curtis nodded toward the safe zone where deputies Field, Welch, and a wounded Hammond were receiving medical attention. 4 law enforcement officers attempted to execute an illegal raid on my property. 3 survived because I chose to use non-lethal force. 1 didn't because he chose to continue attacking after multiple warnings. And you just happen to have military-grade defensive systems on a family farm? "I'm a veteran with PTSD who prefers to be prepared for contingencies," Curtis replied, sticking to the cover story he'd developed years ago. "Everything I used tonight was legally purchased or built from commercially available components." Agent Hayden wasn't buying it, but she also wasn't pushing. Her presence here suggested that certain people in the federal government were aware of storage facility Delta 7 and preferred to keep it quietly contained rather than officially acknowledged. Deputy Dave Field approached them, his face pale but his voice steady. "Agent Hayden, you need to know that Sheriff Garrett had been running criminal operations for years. Deputy Baldwin was part of it, but some of us had no idea what was really happening." "Deputy," Agent Hayden said gently, "why don't you start from the beginning?" As Field began explaining Rex Garrett's corruption network, Curtis found himself watching the county road where Whitney's car had just pulled up. His wife, his estranged wife, he corrected himself, got out, and walked toward the police perimeter with the slow, careful steps of someone whose world had just imploded. Agent Hayden noticed his distraction. "Mrs. Rose. We'll need to speak with her as well." "She was manipulated," Curtis said quietly. "Her father convinced her I was dangerous, fed her fabricated evidence, and used her to set up the timing for tonight's raid. Whitney's a victim in this, not a conspirator. That's for us to determine." Curtis nodded, but his attention was fixed on Whitney as she spoke with the state police investigators. Even from a distance, he could see the devastation in her posture, the way she kept looking toward the field where her father had died. 3 hours ago, she'd been a county clerk married to a farmer. Now, she was a widow whose father had been killed defending his criminal empire. The investigation continued for 6 hours, with federal agents discreetly documenting the defensive systems while state police processed the crime scene. By dawn, the official story had taken shape. Curtis Rose, a military veteran with security training, had defended his property against an illegal raid by corrupt law enforcement officers. Sheriff Rex Garrett had been killed while attacking a civilian installation. Deputies Baldwin, Hammond, and Welch were facing federal charges for their participation in the corruption network. Deputy Field, after 12 hours of interviews, was cleared of any wrongdoing and offered a position with the state police. He accepted, eager to start over somewhere that badges still meant something. As the last of the investigators prepared to leave, Agent Hayden approached Curtis one final time. "Mr. Rose, I want to be clear about something. The facility beneath your property has been officially reclassified as a private security installation. There will be no further federal interest in your operations here, provided they remain defensive in nature." Curtis understood. The government was offering him a deal. Keep the secrets buried, use the facility only for protection, and they pretend none of this had ever happened. It was the kind of arrangement that let everyone involved sleep better at night. Understood, Curtis replied. One more thing. Your wife has asked to speak with you before we finish here. Curtis found Whitney sitting in her car, staring at the field where her father had made his last stand. She looked up as he approached, her eyes red with tears, but no longer holding the confusion and fear he'd seen earlier. I know you'll probably never forgive me, she said quietly, but I need you to understand that I thought I was protecting you. Dad showed me photographs of crime scenes, bank records that suggested you were involved in something illegal. He said if I didn't help him, you'd end up dead or in prison. Curtis studied his wife's face, noting the genuine remorse, but also the damage that could never be fully repaired. Whitney, I forgave you the moment I realized you were being manipulated. But forgiveness doesn't mean we could go back to what we were. I know. She wiped her eyes and looked at him directly for the first time since this began. Will you tell me now who you really are? Curtis considered the question. Whitney deserved some version of the truth, but the full story would only burden her with secrets she couldn't share. I was a soldier, he said finally. Special operations. I did things for the government that I'm not proud of, and when I left the service, I wanted to disappear into a normal life. I chose this property because it offered security, and I chose you because you represented everything I'd lost touch with during my military service: kindness, innocence, the possibility of peace. And now, Curtis looked toward the farmhouse they'd shared, the barn where he'd built his workshop, the fields where he'd planned to raise crops and maybe children. All of it felt like someone else's dream now. Now I think it's time for me to disappear again. You'll be better off without the complications that come with being married to a ghost. Whitney nodded, though fresh tears were starting. Where will you go? Somewhere quiet. Somewhere I can do more good than harm. They sat in silence for several minutes, both of them mourning the death of a marriage that had been built on secrets and ended in betrayal. Finally, Whitney reached into her purse and pulled out her wedding ring. I'll always love the man I thought you were, she said, placing the ring in his palm. I hope someday you can find peace with the man you actually are. Curtis watched his wife drive away toward a future that no longer included him, then turned back toward the farmhouse that had been his sanctuary for 3 years. It was time to pack up his life once again and find a new place to be invisible. But as he began making arrangements to disappear, Curtis Rose found himself smiling for the first time since this nightmare began. Rex Garrett's corrupt network was finished. The good deputies were free to serve with honor, and Whitney was finally free of her father's manipulations. Sometimes, Curtis reflected, the best way to protect the people you loved was to become the monster that their enemies feared. The killing field had served its purpose. Chapter 9. Ghosts End. 6 months later, Curtis Rose officially died in a car accident on a remote highway in Montana. The body was never recovered due to the vehicle's fall into a deep ravine, but dental records and DNA evidence confirmed the identity. Whitney Rose, his widow, collected the life insurance money and used it to start a foundation providing support services for families affected by police corruption. The man who had been Curtis Rose, however, was very much alive and living under a new identity in a small coastal town in Oregon. He'd chosen the name Thomas Gray, a literary reference that amused him, and established himself as a handyman specializing in home security systems for the growing population of retirees who valued privacy and protection. Thomas Gray rented a small apartment above a bookstore, drove a modest pickup truck, and spent his evenings reading novels that he'd never had time for during his operational years. To his neighbors, he was a quiet, competent man who minded his own business and was always willing to help elderly clients install deadbolts or repair broken windows. What they didn't know was that Thomas Gray had spent his first month in town identifying every piece of corruption, every petty crime, and every predator who thought small-town isolation made them invisible. He'd also established a new kind of operational base, not a fortress like storage facility Delta 7, but a network of surveillance and communication that let him monitor threats across a much wider area. The difference was that Thomas Gray wasn't hiding from his past anymore. He was actively using his skills to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The first test came when he discovered that the town's most prominent businessman, Angelo Cross, was trafficking women through his chain of restaurants. The second came when he learned that Deputy Sheriff Sergio Phelps was selling evidence from drug busts back to the dealers who'd been arrested. In both cases, Thomas Gray dealt with the problems quietly and efficiently. Cross woke up one morning to find his computer systems hacked, his financial records downloaded, and evidence of his trafficking operation in the hands of federal investigators. Deputy Phelps discovered that his own corruption had been meticulously documented and reported to the state attorney general's office. Neither man ever learned who had exposed them, but both found themselves facing federal prosecutions that ended their criminal careers permanently. Thomas Gray had found his purpose. He was a ghost who hunted monsters. The irony wasn't lost on him. Rex Garrett had accused him of being dangerous, of lying about who he was, of representing a threat to innocent people. All of those accusations had been true, but Garrett had been too corrupt to understand that sometimes the world needed dangerous men to protect it from predators like himself. On a warm evening in late spring, Thomas was installing a security system for an elderly woman named Grace Carney when his secure phone buzzed with a message from Agent Genevieve Hayden. The text was brief: "Wyoming needs a handyman. Similar problems to what you solved in Iowa." Interested, Thomas smiled as he finished mounting the motion sensor above Mrs. Carney's front door. The FBI, it seemed, had decided that a ghost with his particular skills was worth keeping on an unofficial payroll. It was the kind of arrangement that let everyone involved maintain plausible deniability while actually accomplishing something useful. "Mrs. Carney," he said, "your new security system is fully operational. If anyone tries to break in, it'll alert both you and the police department automatically." "Thank you, Mr. Gray. You're such a nice young man. I feel so much safer knowing you're looking out for us." Thomas packed up his tools and headed home, already planning his response to Agent Hayden's recruitment offer. Wyoming sounded like the kind of place where a man could do good work without attracting too much attention. As he walked through the quiet streets of his adopted town, Thomas reflected on the strange path that had led him here. He'd started as Curtis Rose the soldier, become Curtis Rose the farmer, and now emerged as Thomas Gray the protector. Each identity had taught him something different about himself and what he was capable of. The man who'd once rigged mountains to explode had learned to build instead of destroy. The ghost who'd once killed for politicians was now using his skills to protect innocent people from the predators who thought small towns were easy hunting grounds. Rex Garrett had been right about one thing. Curtis Rose had been lying about who he was. But the sheriff had been wrong about what that meant. The lies hadn't been about being dangerous. They'd been about pretending not to be dangerous when dangerous was exactly what the world needed. Thomas Gray smiled as he climbed the stairs to his apartment, already mentally preparing for his next assignment. Somewhere in Wyoming, monsters were preying on innocent people, secure in their belief that no one could touch them. They were about to learn otherwise. The killing field had been just the beginning. Now the real work could start.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you